I was looking for something else, just browsing digital archives of 1890s Chicago, the kind of tedious scrolling that fills most research hours. Then a photograph came up and my hand stopped. The White City, the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition, shot from above, wide angle. For a moment I couldn't quite process what I was looking at, the scale of it. Domed buildings, colonnades, reflecting pools, sculptures on every surface. It looked like Rome, like Athens, like something built by a civilization that had spent generations learning how to build it. I was looking at Chicago, 1893, and I was reading that it went up in 2 years. Every source said the same thing. Under 2 years. I couldn't close the photograph. I just kept looking. The domes, the colonnades, the reflecting pools, and then reading it again. Under 2 years. I tried to hold the numbers in my head. That much stone, that much detail, that many buildings. How many workers? Where did the material come from? Who coordinated all of it? I couldn't make it add up. What bothered me most wasn't that I couldn't answer it. It was that I hadn't expected it to be hard. So I kept going. I didn't find a simple answer. What I kept finding instead was the same thing showing up again and again in different sources in different contexts. Start with the numbers, because the numbers are solid. Over 600 acres. More than 200 buildings. The administration building had a dome at 275 feet, bigger than the U.S. Capitol at the time. The manufacturer's building covered 44 acres under a single roof. These aren't disputed figures, they're in the official record. I kept putting those numbers next to the timeline and coming up short. The official story absorbs all of this without blinking. I couldn't. Chicago won the bid in 1890. Construction started in 1891. The fair opened May 1893. 27 million visitors in 6 months, closed in October. Within a year, almost all of it was gone. That last part is what snagged me. The explanation is this. They weren't real buildings. The material was called staff, plaster, cement, hemp fiber pressed over wooden frames. Light, fast, cheap. It looked like marble from a distance, but wasn't. Temporary by intention, demolished by plan. First time I read that, it made sense. Explains the speed of construction, explains the demolition, explains the budget. Then I went back to the photograph. Those domes, the colonnade detail, the sculptural work on every surface, and I tried to hold the words temporary stage set against what I was seeing. It didn't quite fit. That explanation held together for me, for a while. Then I started looking at the photographs more carefully. The level of architectural detail wasn't simple. These weren't rough facades. The Court of Honor buildings had thousands of individual sculptural elements, friezes, cornices, columns with mathematically correct classical proportions, decorative panels that would require skilled craftsmen significant time to produce, even with molds. The electricity building alone had intricate ornamentation covering virtually every exterior surface. If you're mass-producing these elements from staff, you still need to create the molds, cast thousands of pieces, transport them, and install them with precision, for hundreds of buildings, simultaneously, in 18 months, with 1890s technology, wooden scaffolding, hand tools, horse-drawn carts. I kept trying to make the timeline work in my head, and I couldn't. That's when I went looking for construction photographs. If you're building the largest construction project in American history, you document it. Photographers were active in Chicago. Photography was well established by 1890. The Brooklyn Bridge, completed a decade earlier, has extensive construction documentation showing every phase. So where are the White City construction photos? They exist, but they're surprisingly limited. You find images of the site in early stages, cleared land, foundation work. You find photographs of completed buildings. But the middle phases, the period where you'd actually see how these techniques worked and how quickly the work progressed, that documentation is strangely sparse. And that started to bother me, because if you built something this remarkable, this quickly, using innovative methods, you'd want to document it. You'd want proof. The photographic record should be extensive. Instead, what you mostly find are images of the finished product. The fair in operation, the buildings complete, as if they'd always been there. And that's when I noticed Chicago wasn't alone. St. Louis, 1904. Same architectural style, same scale, roughly 2 years of construction. Staff material, temporary designation, demolished after closing. I wasn't surprised. That's what made it worse. San Francisco, 1915. I spent more time on this one. Built on reclaimed land, which is its own question. Under 3 years. Same techniques, same outcome. By the third fair, something shifted. 1 compressed timeline is impressive. 2 starts feeling like a pattern. 3, and you're not admiring the efficiency anymore. You're asking why the pattern exists. If you're into this kind of buried history, subscribe. I'm not done with this thread. Then I noticed the dates again. These fairs were happening during the same decades when American cities were discovering their older buildings had first floors underground, streets elevated over time, gradual urban development, the explanation I'd read before, same window, two separate threads landing in the same years. I didn't know what to do with that yet. I still don't entirely. But I'd looked into those explanations before. The scale doesn't match the documentation. The speed doesn't match the records. The world's fairs sit right in the middle of this period. Chicago, St. Louis, San Francisco, all hosting these massive exhibitions, all discovering buried architecture in the same years. I didn't connect those dots intentionally. The pattern just kept appearing. And that's when I started asking a different question. Not how did they build these so fast, but what if they didn't build them at all? At least not when and how the official timeline claims. I know how that sounds, but stay with me. Because what happened after the fairs ended is where this becomes difficult to dismiss. The official story says, most buildings were demolished because they were temporary. Staff deteriorates. No permanent function. The land was valuable. Demolition was inevitable. But here's what actually happened. Many of the buildings didn't get demolished. They burned. The Chicago buildings burned in January 1894, a few months after the fair closed. Official explanation, accidental. The materials were flammable, which we already knew. The Palace of Fine Arts survived. It was stone and steel. That tracks. But some of the plaster structures burned so completely they left almost nothing to examine. I filed that away and moved on. Then I looked at St. Louis. 1904. Same pattern, not controlled demolition, fire. San Francisco 1915, same. Buffalo 1901, same. Each time the flammable materials explanation. Each time a thorough enough burn. I sat with that for a while. A demolished building leaves something. Rubble, foundations, material you can go back to. A burned building leaves ash. I'm not trying to make this into something it isn't. Maybe they were all accidents. 4 cities, 4 fairs, 4 fires. That's possible. Unlikely things happen. I just couldn't move past it. But then there's the part that made me question everything. Some buildings didn't burn, didn't get demolished. They became permanent. The Palace of Fine Arts in San Francisco, still standing. The Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. That was the Palace of Fine Arts from 1893, one of the few permanent structures. It's been in continuous use for over 130 years. So wait, let me make sure this is clear. If these buildings could be made permanent, if they could serve functional purposes for over a century, what does that say about the ones that supposedly couldn't survive? And if the temporary buildings were as flimsy as claimed, plaster over wooden frames, why did some require fires to be destroyed rather than simple dismantling? Both types supposedly built the same way, in the same time frame, with the same materials. Some of these structures lasted 6 months. Some are still standing. Both of those things can't be true at the same time. Either the material held up or it didn't. I went looking for somewhere in the record that addresses this directly. Maybe it exists. I didn't find it. Something else caught me. The fairs displayed what they called artifacts from around the world, ancient sculptures, historical facades, architectural elements from other cultures. I started asking where those actually came from. The answer I kept finding, loans, donations, reproductions made for the exhibitions. I went looking for the documentation on that too. One building stopped me. The Japanese pavilion, or what they called the Japanese pavilion, built for the exhibition, according to the records. I kept looking at the roofline joinery and the photographs. That kind of woodwork takes decades to learn, not something a crew produces in months after being handed a blueprint. I wanted to find someone who'd looked at this specifically. An architectural historian, a craftsman, anyone. Maybe they have. Maybe there's a clean explanation I haven't found. But I couldn't get past that joinery, and a question I haven't been able to shake. What if some of what was displayed wasn't built for the fair? What if some of it already existed, and the fair was how it got shown before it disappeared? I don't know. That's not a conclusion, it's just where I keep ending up. I can't prove that definitively, but the question felt less absurd the deeper I looked. Here's what we know without interpretation. Major American cities hosted massive architectural exhibitions between 1890 and 1920. These featured elaborate neoclassical structures built, according to records, in impossibly short time frames using temporary materials. Most were destroyed shortly after, many by fire. A few became permanent civic buildings still standing today. This happened during the same period when urban landscapes were being dramatically altered, and older buildings were being discovered buried. Each piece has an explanation that sounds reasonable, alone. But when you stack the timeline, when you look at the pattern across cities, when you notice what's missing from the construction record and what's present in the destruction record, the official narrative starts needing too many coincidences. It's not one anomaly, it's the accumulation. Missing construction documentation. Identical styles across fairs separated by years and geography. Convenient fires destroying evidence. The paradox of temporary buildings becoming permanent, century-old structures. The timing overlap with massive, unexplained urban changes. And one question the standard explanation doesn't answer. If these were celebrated achievements that drew millions, if they represented extraordinary examples of American innovation, why the urgency to destroy them? Why not preserve more as parks or cultural centers? Why not study them as examples of rapid construction techniques? Why not maintain them as tourist attractions given how beloved they were? The official answer: the buildings were deteriorating, maintenance would be expensive, the land was more valuable for other purposes. But those answers assume rapid deterioration. They assume no preservation alternative existed. They assume cultural value was negligible. Those are significant assumptions for structures that hosted the most visited events in American history up to that point, events that drew international attention and national pride. It started with one photograph, 2 years to build, 1 year to vanish. I pulled that thread and other threads came with it. Here's what I can actually say. I couldn't find a consistent explanation. The construction timelines don't hold, the fires were too thorough, the documentation is too thin. Each of those things has an answer. I read the answers. Some of them satisfied me, some didn't. The question I keep returning to is simple. Were these buildings actually built from scratch? I don't know. I can't prove otherwise. But the joinery on that pavilion roof, the Palace of Fine Arts surviving when it shouldn't have, the gap between structures that lasted 6 months and structures still standing a century later, those things sit with me and don't move. Maybe there's a straightforward explanation, and I'm missing it. Maybe there isn't. I can't honestly tell you which. The photographs are still in the archives. The records exist. The surviving buildings stand. You can examine them yourself. You can study the timelines. You can look at what's documented and what isn't. The 1893 White City. The evidence remains. What's missing is comprehensive documentation of the construction process that would prove the official timeline. And I keep coming back to that gap, because the more I look, the wider it gets. If you've seen photos, records, or details that point in another direction, leave them in the comments. I'm still looking.